The women of Larkspur had a game they played on Saturdays, though none of them would ever have called it a game, for they were respectable women and thought themselves kind, and the game was this: to watch Cora Vale walk the length of the snow-packed main street with her mending basket on her arm, and to lean their bonneted heads together as she passed, and to laugh behind their gloved hands at the scarred woman who was too ugly, they all agreed, ever to be loved. Cora knew the game. She had known it for 8 years. And she had learned, over those 8 years, to walk the whole length of that street with her chin level and her back straight and her eyes fixed on the far end of it, carrying her basket and her shame together as though neither weighed a thing, and to let their laughter break over her like cold water over a stone, which is to say it wet her through every time, and every time she pretended it did not. She was 26 years old. She was a seamstress and a laundress and whatever else would earn an honest coin, and she was good at all of it. Quick and clean and fair, though half the town would sooner send their washing 3 towns over than have the scarred woman's hands touch it. The scars ran down the left side of her face from her temple to her jaw, and on down her throat, and along the back of her left hand, old burns gone smooth and silvery pink with the years, and they pulled the corner of her mouth just slightly, so that she seemed always to be, on the point of a rueful smile, she was not smiling. Below the scars her face was, had anyone in Larkspur troubled to look, a fine and gentle face, with steady gray eyes and dark hair she wore pinned simply back. But no one in Larkspur troubled to look. They saw the scars, and they stopped looking, the way the town women stopped looking, the way the men who might once have courted a girl as steady and kind as Cora Vale stopped looking, and in 8 years not one soul in that town had looked past the burned side of Cora's face to the whole of her, save one, and he was too young to count, for he was her brother. Tam Vale was 12, and he was the reason Cora bore the scars, and he was the reason she bore everything else besides. 8 years gone, when Cora was 18 and Tam a babe of 4, their house had burned in the black of a winter night, a spark from a banked fire catching the dry timber while the family slept, and Cora had woken to smoke and screaming, and had gotten herself out the window and into the snow, and then had heard her baby brother crying in the burning house behind her, and she had gone back in. She had gone back into the fire for him. She had found him in his cot half choked with smoke and wrapped him in a wet blanket and carried him out through a wall of flame that took the left side of her as its price. And their parents had not gotten out at all, and Cora had knelt in the snow with their brother safe in her arms and her own flesh burning, and understood in that one night that she was, from now until the end, the only thing standing between this child and the cold. She had been standing there ever since. She had raised him alone on a seamstress's coin, fed him and clothed him and taught him his letters and loved him fierce as fire, and she did not regret 1 inch of her ruined skin, not one, for the boy was alive and grown tall and good, and that was worth more than a smooth face in any accounting Cora Vale cared to keep. Let the town women laugh. She had walked into a fire for love once already. Their laughter did not frighten her much after that. It was on such a Saturday, in the deep of that winter, that Callum Reeve first truly saw her. He was the richest man for 100 miles, was Callum Reeve, though you would never have known it to look at him, and the whole of Larkspur both feared and courted him for it. He owned the great timberlands that climbed the mountains above the town, and the sawmill on the river, and the freight contracts, and the fine empty house on the hill that he almost never slept in, preferring his rough cabin up at the logging camp among his men. He was near 40, a broad and weathered man gone quiet from too many years alone in the high timber, with dark hair and a dark close beard and pale watchful eyes. And he came down into Larkspur but rarely. And when he did, every unwed woman in the town and every mother of an unwed woman set upon him like gulls upon a dropped crust. For a man that rich and that unmarried was the great prize of the territory, and it was generally agreed that whoever landed Callum Reeve would be a queen. He suffered their attentions with a stone-faced patience and married none of them, and it was whispered he thought himself too good for Larkspur girls, and it was whispered he was cold, and it was whispered a great many things. For a rich and silent man is a blank page the whole world writes its guesses on. On that Saturday he had come down for supplies, and he stood on the boardwalk outside the mercantile in the falling snow, and he watched Cora Vale walk the length of the street, and he watched the fine bonneted women lean their heads together and laugh, and he watched the scarred woman carry her basket through their laughter with her chin held level and her eyes fixed on the far end of the street, not hurrying, not flinching, and something in the sight of it struck Callum Reeve like a hand laid flat against his chest. He had spent his life among men who did hard and dangerous things, and he knew courage when he saw it. The real kind. The quiet kind that has nothing to prove and everything to endure, and he saw more of it in Cora Vale walking that one cold street than he had seen in most men walking into a burning mill. He asked the mercantile keeper, lo, who she was, and the keeper told him, the Vale woman, the seamstress, scarred in a fire years back, raises the boy alone. And here the keeper lowered his voice as though sharing something shameful. Folks don't much like to look at her. Poor thing, too marked up. No man'll have her. Pity. She does good work, though, if you can stomach the "I'll thank you," said Callum Reeve, in a voice that stopped the keeper's mouth like a slammed door, not to finish that sentence. And he took his mending. A whole sack of it he suddenly discovered he had. Torn shirts and split seams from the whole logging camp that had wanted mending for a month, and he asked where the seamstress kept her shop, and he walked down the snowy street through the astonished silence of the bonneted women to find her. Cora's shop was the front room of the small rented house she shared with Tam, warm and clean and smelling of soap and cedar, with a good fire and a sewing table by the window for the light. She looked up when the big man ducked through her low door, and Callum watched her do the thing she had trained herself to do with strangers, which was to turn the scarred side of her face a little away, a small habitual motion of self-protection, and he found he did not like to see her do it, though he understood it well enough. "I've mending," he said, gruff, setting down his sack. "A good deal of it. My men are hard on their clothes, and there's no one at the camp can sew a straight seam. I'll pay fair, and I'll pay in advance, and there's more where this came from, steady if the work suits." He named a price that was half again what the work was worth, and Cora's steady gray eyes came up and studied him a moment with a shrewdness that missed nothing. "That's too much," she said, "by half. I'll do it for the fair price or not at all. I don't take charity, Mr. Reeve, and I don't need pity, and if that's what this is, you can carry your sack right back out my door." Callum Reeve looked at her a long moment, and then, for the first time and longer than he could rightly remember, the corner of his own hard mouth moved. "The fair price, then," he said, "and it isn't charity, and it isn't pity. It's mending. I'll be back Thursday." And he ducked back out into the snow, and Cora stood looking at the closed door with an expression she could not have named, and something she had thought burned out of her a long time ago stirred once, faintly in the ashes, and she told it sternly to lie back down, for she knew better, she knew far better than to let it wake. But he did come back Thursday. and the Thursday after. All that long winter Callum Reeve found reasons to come down out of his high timber and duck through Cora Vale's low door. More mending than any logging camp on earth could have generated, and slowly, seam by seam, a thing grew between them that neither of them spoke of and both of them guarded. He would sit in her warm front room while she worked, too large for the little chair, and they would talk, or more often not talk, for they were both people who had learned the uses of silence, and Callum found he could sit quiet in that firelit room in a way he had not been able to sit quiet anywhere since he was a boy. He came to know Tam, and to like the grave, clever boy, and to bring him small things, a good knife, a book, a puzzle of bent nails, never enough to shame the proud sister, always enough to make the fatherless boy's face light. He came to know Cora, her dry wit that showed only when she trusted you, her fierce love for her brother, her flat refusal of anything that smelled of pity, the way she turned the scarred side of her face from strangers and, by slow degrees over that winter, stopped turning it from him. And Callum Reeve, who had held the whole angling town at stone-faced arm's length for years, sat in a scarred seamstress's front room and lost his hard-guarded heart entire, and knew it, and did not fight it, for it was the first thing in a long gray while that had felt to him like being alive. There was a reason Callum Reeve set such store by a woman who would not take his money, and Cora came to learn it slowly, in pieces, the way she came to learn everything about him. He had not been born rich. He had been born poorer than the Vales, the son of a broke and drunken teamster, and he had clawed his way up out of nothing, with his own 2 hands and 20 years of brutal labor, and he had learned along the way exactly what his growing money did to the people around him. He told her, one gray afternoon by her fire, of a girl he had loved when he was young and had nothing, a girl he had meant to marry, who had wed a shopkeeper with a going concern the year before Callum's first timber contract came through and made him a man of means, and who had looked at him ever after with a soft regret that had taught him more about the worth of the town's affection than any sermon ever could. After that I watched them all come round, he said, once the money showed. The same folk who'd not have crossed the street for me when I was ragged, lining up with their daughters. I could have had my pick of Larkspur any year these 10 years, and every one of them was looking at the mill and the timber and the house on the hill, and not one of them was looking at me. And I knew it, and it made me hard. He looked at her steady. Then a scarred seamstress threw my money back in my face inside of 2 minutes of meeting me and told me to carry my charity sack out her door. Do you know, Cora, that's the first time in 10 years a soul in this town told me no. I near proposed to you on the spot. Cora had laughed at that, her rare true laugh, and had not understood that he was more than half in earnest. She had cause to. She had been courted once, at 19, the year after the fire, by a young man who had seemed kind, who had seemed to see past the scars, and she had let herself hope. And then she had overheard him one evening laughing with his friends about the burned girl he was only walking out with on a dare, to see could he stand to kiss a face like that. And she had gone home and wept the whole of one night and never wept over such a thing again. She had built a wall after that, high and thick, and she had lived behind it 8 years and found it kept out the cold well enough. And now here came Callum Reeve, the richest man in the territory, ducking through her door twice a week, with his eyes gone soft in a way that frightened her more than all the town's laughter ever had. And every sensible thing in her said the same thing the town would say, was already beginning to say, that a man like that could not truly want a woman like her, that it must be pity or a passing fancy or some cruelty she could not yet see the shape of, that she would be a a plain scarred fool, to let her heart out from behind its wall for a rich man who could have any smooth-faced girl in the country for the asking. And so she kept it walled. She was kind to him, and she was honest with him, and she gave him not 1 inch past the seam of a mended shirt, and if it cost her something to do it, if she lay awake some nights behind her wall listening to the something in the ashes that would not quite lie down, that was her own affair, and she told no one, least of all him. Once, that winter, he took them up to the timber camp, Cora and Tam both in his big sledge behind a team of steaming horses, up through the snow-hung pines to the high clearing where his men worked. Cora had gone meaning only to deliver a season's mending, but she stayed the afternoon, and what she saw there changed something in how she understood the silent man beside her. She saw how his rough crew of loggers, hard men all, went quiet and respectful when he passed, not from fear but from a plain regard she recognized as the thing men give only to a leader who has bled beside them. She saw him stop and take the axe from a green young logger and show him, patient, the true way to set his cut, no shame in it, only teaching. She saw him crouch in the snow to look at another man's frostbit hand and quietly order the fellow down to town to the doctor, and not to come back till it healed, wages paid the while. This was not the cold, proud man the town whispered of. This was a man who carried 100 families' livelihoods up in that high timber and did not set the weight of it down. And Cora, watching him from the cook shack door with her mending forgotten in her arms, felt the wall inside her give 1 dangerous inch. And Tam was in heaven, and Callum let the boy ride the log sledge and taught him to sight a tree's fall and answered his 1,000 questions grave as scripture, and on the ride back down in the blue dusk, the boy fell asleep against the big man's arm. And Callum drove one-handed the whole way so as not to wake him, and Cora looked at her sleeping brother tucked against the great timber baron's side, and had to turn her scarred face to the snow so neither of them would see what was in it. Cora had 1 friend in Larkspur, and only one, and it was old Ruth Meacham, who kept the boarding house at the end of the street. A stout widow with a face like a walnut and a heart the town's cruelty had never once managed to shrink. Ruth had brought her washing to Cora for years when no one else would, and had sat up with her the winter the fever nearly took little Tam, and it was Ruth who saw, before Cora would admit it to herself, what was happening behind the scarred woman's careful face that winter. "You've gone and let him in," Ruth said one evening, plain as bread, watching Cora fail to sew a straight seam for the 3rd time running. "That great quiet Reeve man, he's under the wall, isn't he?" And when Cora said nothing, only pressed her lips together, the old woman laid a gnarled hand over hers. "Child, I've watched you keep the whole world out 8 years, and I never once blamed you for it. The way this town's used you. But a wall keeps out the warm same as the cold. You've a right to be loved, Cora Vale, whatever that gaggle of geese on the street tells you. You walked into a fire once. Don't you tell me you've not the nerve to let 1 good man walk into your parlor." Cora had wanted to believe her. She had gone home that night turning the old woman's words over like a warm stone in her pocket. But belief is a fragile thing in a soul long starved of it, and it takes only a little poison to kill it, and the poison was already being brewed. The town noticed everything, and what the town noticed most was that Callum Reeve, the great prize, the queen-maker, was spending his winter in the front room of the scarred Vale woman, and this the town could not abide. Chief among those who could not abide it was Prudence Gaines, the merchant's daughter, who was 19 and golden-haired and accounted the beauty of Larkspur, and who had spent 2 years in considerable effort setting her cap at Callum Reeve, and who now watched the fortune she considered rightfully hers being sewn up, seam by seam, by a burned laundress 8 years her elder. Prudence Gaines was not accustomed to losing, and she did not intend to lose to Cora Vale, and she set about the matter with the particular cold cruelty of a pretty girl who has learned that prettiness excuses much. She spoke to Cora sweetly in the mercantile where others could hear of how good it was of Mr. Reeve to throw a little charity work to the less fortunate, how like him, how kind, and did Cora not think it a mercy that a wealthy man would trouble himself over one so afflicted? She let it be understood, everywhere, that Callum Reeve's interest in the Vale woman was pure Christian pity and nothing more, that of course it could be nothing more, that any woman who imagined otherwise would be pitiable indeed. And she said these things loud enough and often enough and sweet enough that they reached Cora's ears a dozen times over, dressed as concern, sharp as any knife, and they found, as such things do, the exact soft place beneath the wall that Cora had never quite managed to armor, the place that had always believed them true. So that when Callum came the next Thursday, gruff and warm and settling his too large frame into her too small chair, Cora did not sit to her work. She stood by the fire with her back straight and her scarred face turned half away, and she said, in a voice she kept flat by main force, "I'll not be taking more of your mending, Mr. Reeve. My work's grown, I've other custom now I've no more time for." For charity sacks got up to give a poor scarred woman something to feel proud of. It was kindly meant, I don't doubt, but I'd sooner you didn't come again. And she watched the words land on him, watched something in his weathered face go still and then go wounded, and it near killed her, but she held her ground behind her wall, because a wall was a thing she understood and hope was not. And she had walked into one fire in her life and did not think she could survive walking into another. Callum Reeve stood. He stood a long moment in her firelit room, turning his hat in his big hands, and she waited for him to argue or to plead or to grow angry, and he did none of those. He only looked at her at the scarred side of her face she had turned from him, and he said, very low, "Who told you it was charity?" And when she did not answer, he nodded slowly as though she had, and something hardened in his eyes that was not aimed at her. "I've said this badly all winter," he said, "or not said it at all, which is worse, being a coward's way, and I've never been called a coward but the once, and it was true that once, and it's true now. So I'll say it plain, and you can do with it what you like. It was never charity, Cora, not one stitch of it. I brought that first sack because it was the only way I could think of to be in a room with you, and I've brought every sack since for the same reason, and if you tell me to go, I'll go, and I'll not trouble you again, but I'll not have you thinking I ever once pitied you, for it's the furthest thing from the truth there is. A man doesn't pity the bravest soul in the territory. He just tries to be worthy of sitting in her front room." And he set down his hat, and he picked it back up, and he went out into the snow, and Cora Vale sank down into her sewing chair and put her scarred face in her hands, and sat there a very long time while the fire burned low. It might have ended there, in silence and wounded pride on both sides, if it had not been for the Christmas social. The whole of Larkspur turned out for it, in the timber-raftered town hall hung with pine boughs, and lit gold with 100 candles, the fiddler tuning up and the long tables groaning, and every soul in the district crowded in out of the snow. Cora had not meant to go, but Tam had begged her, for there would be other children and cake and music, and she had not the heart to keep the boy from it, and so she had washed and pinned her hair and put on her one good gray dress and gone, telling herself she would stand at the edge and watch her brother be happy and slip out early. She stood at the edge, she watched, and Prudence Gaines, golden and triumphant in a gown from a city catalog, watched her back across the crowded, warm hall with the patient eyes of a cat, and waited for her moment, and took it. It came when the fiddlers struck up and the couples formed for the dancing, and Prudence, at the center of a laughing knot of the town's young people, raised her sweet, clear voice just high enough to carry, just innocent enough to deny. "Oh, do let's not stand up yet," she said. "We're short of gentlemen. Though I suppose," and here she turned, and her bright eyes found Cora at the edge of the crowd, and the knot of young people turned and found her too, "we might ask Miss Vale to dance. If any gentleman here is brave enough, though I shouldn't wonder if a man would want the candles put out first." And she laughed, her pretty silver laugh, and the young people around her laughed, and the laughter spread out across the warm gold hall the way it always spread, and Cora Vale stood alone at the edge of it with her scarred face burning and her brother somewhere in the crowd about to see his sister made a public sport, and for the first time in 8 years she felt the wall inside her crack. Straight through, felt the tears rise that she had sworn no townsperson would ever again see her shed. And she turned to flee the hall before they fell. And Callum Reeve crossed the room. He had been standing by the far wall, and he set down his cup, and he crossed the whole length of that crowded hall through the dying laughter with his eyes fixed on Cora and on no one else. And the crowd fell back and went quiet before the look on his face, and Prudence Gaines's silver laugh died in her throat as the great prize she had schemed 2 years for walked past her as though she were a post in the ground. He reached Cora at the door. He stopped before her. And, in the ringing silence of that whole watching town, Callum Reeve reached out and took the scarred woman's scarred left hand in both of his, gently, and raised it and looked at it, the silvered burns she had hidden for 8 years. And then he looked at her wet gray eyes, and he said, low, but in that hushed hall every soul heard it, "This is the hand that carried her baby brother out of a fire. Every mark on it was paid for saving a life. There's not a person in this room has done a braver thing nor a truer one, and the most of you can't even bear to look at the proof of it." He lifted her scarred hand and pressed his lips to it slow and unashamed before the whole town, and then he raised his eyes to the room. "I'm going to marry this woman," he said, "if she'll have a slow fool who took a whole winter to find his tongue. Not out of charity, not out of pity. Because she's the finest thing this town ever had and was too blind to see, and any soul here who laughs at her again will answer to me for it, and I'll not be gentle." He looked back down at Cora, and his weathered face was as open as she had ever seen a face, all the stone gone out of it. "I'd sooner have you scarred, Cora Vale, than any smooth-faced woman in 100 towns," he said, quiet for her now, only for her. "The scars are just where the world can see how much you were willing to love. Marry me. Let me spend what I've got showing you were always worth looking at." The whole hall had gone utterly still. Cora Vale stood with her scarred hand in the hands of the richest man in the territory, and the tears she had meant to flee spilled over after all. But they were not the tears she had feared, and across the silent hall she saw her brother Tam pushing forward through the crowd with his face alight. And she saw Prudence Gaines white and forgotten by the wall, and she saw 8 years of laughter turned in one moment to ash, and she found that the wall she had lived behind so long had simply fallen, all at once, and she had not died of it. She had not died of it at all. "Callum Reeve," she said, and her voice shook but it carried, "you are a slow fool." All winter. She was weeping and laughing at once. Yes, God help me, yes, and Callum Reeve, the coldest man in Larkspur, gathered the scarred seamstress into his arms and kissed her, full and warm and glad, in the middle of the town hall before the whole astonished district, and after a stunned moment somebody began to clap, and then somebody else, for a town is a fickle thing and loves a wedding better than it loves a scandal. And the fiddler, who was a romantic, struck up a reel, and the only two souls in Larkspur who did not join the sudden celebration were Prudence Gaines, who left early, and Tam Vale, who was too busy being spun off his feet by the enormous laughing man who was going to be his brother. They were married in the spring in the same timber-raftered hall where the town had laughed at her. And this time the whole of Larkspur turned out not to mock, but to celebrate. For a town loves nothing so well as to pretend it was always on the right side of a thing. Ruth Meacham wept in the front row and did not trouble to hide it. Tam stood up beside Callum in a new coat and carried the ring on a cushion and did not lose it, though he confessed after that he had gripped it so hard his hand ached for an hour. Cora wore no veil. She had thought long about it, and she had decided, and she walked the length of that hall with the scarred side of her face turned full to the light and her chin held level. The same walk she had walked so many cold Saturdays through so much laughter, only now there was no laughter in it, only a man at the end of the aisle looking at her as though she were the only lit window in a dark country. And Cora Vale went up the hill to the fine house that Callum Reeve had kept empty all those years, waiting, though he had not known for what. And she filled it with warmth and with her brother, and in the fullness of time, with children of their own, and she was mistress of the richest house and the greatest timberlands in the whole of that country. But that was the least of what she gained, and she knew it. What she gained was a man who looked at the burned side of her face first, on purpose, every morning of their lives, because he said it was his favorite part, being the bravest part, and who never once in all their years together let her turn it away. The town that had laughed came round, as towns do, and made much of Mrs. Reeve, and Cora let them, for she had no more use for old grievances than she had for old walls. But she never forgot the 8 cold years, and she made it her particular work. All the rest of her days to find the other marked and shunned and laughed at souls that every town keeps at its edges, and to look at them full and unflinching, the way one man had once looked at her across a snowy street and seen not the scars but the whole of what the scars had cost. For she had learned the truest thing there is to learn in this hard world, which the town of Larkspur and all its Saturday cruelty had never troubled to know, that a scar is only the mark left where something was loved enough to be worth the burning, and that there is no more beautiful thing that a face can wear.